My name is John E. Miller. I served in the Marine Corps, regular Marine Corps from 1963 to 1967. And then I served in the reserves from about 1972 to about 1981. Well, originally I'm from the Midwest. I'm out in California now, but originally I was born and raised in a small town in Illinois, Rock Island. My dad got a job out here in California, and so he came out here alone, and then later he brought my mom out and the children. I was 16 then, and no, I was just turned 17. And then he lost the job almost as quick as we came out here. So my parents went back to Illinois, but I stayed out here with my aunts. I had two aunts and two uncles, and the one uncle was a World War II Marine veteran. He had been on Tarawa, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Tinian. He got wounded in Tarawa. He got wounded severely in Tinian, uh, and was out of the war for the duration. Um, he's really the one that made me want to join the Marine Corps. He was a white Russian. He was born in Russia. His father was a Russian, the Tsarist officer, and he was executed in 1915 or 1916. And no, I'm sorry, not 1920, because he was born in 1919. And then his mother brought him and his brother to the United States. So he was a really good source for me to want to join the Marine Corps. Um, I really didn't have a lot of interest in any of the other branches of the service. I wanted to join the Marine Corps, I mean, partly because of my uncle, but it was also partly because the Marine Corps had an ethos that I really respected. And they've stayed with that ethos as long as I can remember. In fact, I think it's even tougher now with the crucible in the Marine Corps. I don't really know if I could go 52 hours, out in the boonies, even when I was 17. When I went in the Marine Corps when I was 17, I graduated from high school out here in Los Angeles on a Thursday, and I went into boot camp on the following Monday. And I probably would have went Friday if they had let me, but it was, that wasn't to be. But I honestly joined the military and the Marine Corps because I was very patriotic. My mom was patriotic. My dad was a World War II and Korea War veteran. My grandfather was a World War I veteran. Two of his brothers were killed in France in the First World War. So I had a history. Now my father, honestly, even though he was a veteran, I really didn't know him. My mom and him divorced when the war ended. I was born in 1946, so the war had just ended, and my dad came back from overseas, and him and my mom divorced. So I really didn't know my dad at all. But I knew that he was a veteran. But he died without me ever meeting him. He moved on, had another family, and so I only claim him as my father because I admired what he did in the Second World War and in Korea, and I did learn a lot about him from my sisters. I contacted his new family, and they told me about him. So, but he was in the army, and I was the only one in my whole family ever that went into the Marines. Most of my family were in the army, some were in the Navy in World War II, uh, but I was the only one, and my uncle uh, really was, he taught me I mean, he had a foot locker full of war souvenirs, Japanese saber, samurai swords, and officers and an enlisted. He had a pistol. He had photographs. He had a really, really neat Japanese battle flag that all of his men in his platoon had signed in the one. He had a photo of it that was in a book that was published. So he's really the reason that I went into the Marines on a personal level, but on my own level, I really was patriotic. I was very idealistic then. When you're 17, you do become idealistic and you become more in tune to your inner self and not overlooking the big picture. But I always thought that it was more important to give to my country than to take from it. And I always have tried to do that my whole life. I did about 16 years all told in the Marine Corps, and I did 40 years with the Los Angeles Police Department. And then I retired in 2007. And so I live here in Ventura County, which is a city called Simi Valley, which is just over the border from Los Angeles. We're the first city, east of Los Angeles. And I've lived here with my wife now for 27 years. We raised our grandchildren here. We had a granddaughter that lived with us all of her life, but she passed away several years ago from an allergy attack. So we're happy here. I am a member of the Marine Corps League. I was a commandant for a long time, and I belong to the DAV. I belong to the Marine Corps League. I belong to the American Legion, the VFW. I think that's it. And I pay all these dues, but I hardly go to any meetings. The only meetings I go to is the Marine Corps League, which is every first Thursday of each month, because I have a lot of investment there. So that's about what I have. Four beautiful children. I have 7 wonderful grandchildren. 4 of them are adults now, and just the one that passed away, and then I have the 2 that are still younger. The youngest is 10, and her older brother is 16. Those are the 2 youngest. When I came out to California, we had at that time a platoon that came in from all of Southern California called the Dodger Platoon. We were all from San Bernardino, Los Angeles, Ventura County. We were all Southern California boys. And at the same time, they had one from Northern California called the Giants Platoon. So we all joined at the same time in a ceremony at City Hall. And that was on June 25th of 1963. And after getting sworn in again, that was probably about the 4th time that we had been sworn in, we got on buses. And for the first time on the way to San Diego, I saw the Pacific Ocean. And I said, even though I had been out here for several months, I went to school most of the time. I worked part-time. I didn't have a car. So I never really seen the Pacific Ocean until we went down to San Diego. And of course, we got to San Diego, and as soon as that bus stopped, the drill instructors come in and were calling us all kinds of maggots and pus guts, and get off the bus and get on the yellow footprints. And we're all running around. We didn't know what to do, but we all got off the bus and we all got on the yellow footprints. And the drill instructors screamed at us and told us, we had to go in and get our hair cut. That was like the first thing we did. We all lined up and got our hair shaved, and then we went and got our buckets and put all our gear in it, our name tags, our Brasso soap, everything we needed, a rubber nameplate. And then we proceeded to get all our gear together. I don't remember if we got our clothing that night, but I'm assuming we did, because I remember they told us to package up. If we wanted to send our civilian clothes back home, we could, or we could donate them to the Navy Relief, which I think most of the guys did. I did. I donated them. They took all our, if we had a watch or rings, we had to check them in. And I remember our drill instructor was a Samoan, a senior drill instructor named Donald Solomon. The finest man I ever met in my life, other than my junior drill instructor, who I still am friends with. We meet once every 3 months. Our junior drill instructor, we had two, was Sergeant Ray Del Rio and Corporal Ray Hicks. But Hicks left early on, and the one thing I remember about boot camp was they kept you running no matter where you went. And we did get sea bags with our goodies in it. That's true. I do remember that. And we had Quonset huts in those days at the north end of MCRD. And we got inside and they got foot lockers. We had to put everything in a foot locker. And then they gave you a strip of tape, of adhesive tape, and you put that on your bunk. My bunk, I was on the top bunk, and it was on the starboard side. Well, everybody put it on, and we had the rubber stamp. You had to put your name on it, J.E. Miller. Well, we were dead tired, and we didn't get down there probably till 8 o'clock, and this was probably 3 a.m. in the morning, and the Sergeant Solomon came in and said, those tapes don't belong on the starboard side. They belong in the front. Well, we had to do like 20 push-ups, or I don't remember how many it was. But we did so many that we were numb. Well, getting that adhesive tape was almost impossible when your arms are numb. So I remember taking this hand and holding and taking my fingernail, and getting just a little bit of the tape off and then pulling off. And that's about how everybody did. Then we had, okay, yeah, but I mentioned about the hand, how I got that off. And then we had to put it on the front of the bunk. And that was probably so the drill instructors, when they were walking down, could look over and see what your names were. But everybody got, we had a guy named Croucher who became Creature. We had a guy named Goodman who became Shithead for whatever reason. And he was born, he should have never told the drill instructor that he was a pastor's son, and his name was Goodman. And he was very religious. I was not given a name. My name was Miller, so what were they going to do with Miller other than make it Killer Miller? And they weren't going to do that. The only one I really remember was Croucher became Creature, and I remember that mainly because he was the only one in our platoon that didn't qualify with the rifle. We had M14s then. The M1s had just been phased out. The M14s everybody loved them. They were a little heavy. We liked them though because they were automatic and because they were magazine fed. I remember in boot camp, we would always run. The airport was nearby. Was it Lindbergh Field? I think it is. And one of the guys in our outfit's name was Dare. And for one of the runs we were doing, we were running right along the fence, and the jets were taking off. And he looked over and got the attention of Solomon. And Solomon said, "Go catch it." So he had to not run anymore. He had to jettison ahead of everybody and run down as far as the fence went. And then he had to run back, and he kept having him run back and forth until we caught up with him. And then he told him to go back to the beginning and start over. Well, we ran at a jogging pace. Well, he had to run. And one of the not Solomon, but Del Rio had to run with him. But they took shifts. They didn't run all the way. And I remember we had to run by the Navy's boot camp. And then the sailors were out there in like little dinghy rowboats in this little island. And then there was a little lagoon. And they were maybe up to their thighs, in water, doing whatever it was. Here we were running, and they were out doing things in the water. But that was the only time I ever remember seeing the Navy, because we didn't go that way that often. And we came back and we went to qualify. And we went to shoot because you had to go. You spent 10 days at the range. It was the Camp Matthews, which was a distance away from MCRD. And we called them cattle cars. They weren't 6 bys. They were those ones that were connected to a truck, like a modern, except they were just wooden seats, and they were kind of like in a I can't really just. They were smaller at the top, and then they got bigger, and then you just sat in the seats, and we called them cattle cars. They took us up to Camp Matthews. We were, I think, the second or third last class to qualify at Camp Matthews. After that, they gave it to a college, and now it's a campus for some state college. But Camp Matthews, they turned you over to instructors, and the instructors were strict, but they weren't as disciplined as our drill instructors. Now, drill instructors left you alone when you were in the range. Of course, every night you had to leave the range and go back to the tents, and they would run you back there. And I remember pre-qual day, which was a Thursday, Crucher didn't qualify then either. And he had to run in the front of our squad or our platoon with his rifle over his head and then run around us till we got back. And then when we got back, he was in our tent. We never seen him again for the rest of the day until chow. And then the next day he didn't qualify, and he was the only one. And we were the honor platoon for our series. But if you don't get the ribbon for qualifying, because everybody has to qualify, or you don't get the streamer for your guidon. They mentioned that, well, even though we were the honor platoon, they mentioned we graduated. We had one recruit that didn't qualify, therefore we didn't have, the streamer. I don't really remember a lot of, I was never harassed. I know twice I got smacked, and both times, I deserved it, and both times it was with Solomon. If Sergeant Del Rio or Hicks were drilling us, we drilled hard, but when you saw Solomon, we clicked our heels a lot harder because he was very tough on us. But none of them were unfair. I never thought. But Solomon caught me when we were swimming, and we were A to B. And it's kind of difficult for me to be A to B with a guy in swimming trunks that's right in front of you with no shirt on and just shorts. So I don't know. I know I looked around, and he was right behind me, and he grabbed me by the stack and swivel. And the stack swivel is what when I joined it's called a chokehold. So the C clamp is when they grab you here by your esophagus, and he went up high. So I knew he was later. I didn't know at that time. I thought maybe he could kill me, but at the time I realized later that he did it up high. Well, if he did, I don't know, he could break your hyoid or something, but he did it up high, where it shuts off your wind and your vocal cords. You couldn't talk. And he was calling me names and telling me I was stupid. And he said, when I tell you to get asshole to belly button, I mean asshole to belly button. And after that, I did. He got me once, and then we had a Spanish admiral came to inspect us, and he was with the commandant. And the commandant at that time was General Shoup. And General Shoup I'd heard about because I knew he had earned the Medal of Honor on Tearaway. So I knew who he was, and I was amazed that he was so short, when he came to inspect us. And but before we were inspected, we had to have an envelope fold on our cot, on our rack. And Solomon called me in, and I knew I was in trouble because he called me out of ranks. And then when I got in, he asked me how many inches the fold was supposed to be. And I said, sir, 4. And he says, how many's 4? You put your 4 fingers up. So I put my 4 fingers up on the fold, and it was probably a half an inch bigger than it should be. Well, it had just been the swagger sticks that the Marine Corps drill instructors used to carry were banned. Uh, so Solomon carried a cleaning rod, and the cleaning rod was about that long. Was a cleaning rod for the M14. Well, he carried that kind of like a swagger stick, and it had a little handle on it. And before I could even move my hand, he'd come across and he whacked me across the knuckles with that. And then he told me, you know, hey, we got this Spanish admiral coming in here. I don't want him to think we're shitbirds. Fix it. So, you know, I fixed it. When I finished it, I just said, sir, yes, sir, and ran back out. Those are the only two times that I ever had anything happen to me. And both times was never severe. I mean, I didn't think. I never saw anything in our uh the I think it was 8 weeks or 12 weeks because we graduated in September. I never saw any brutality. I mean, they weren't pussyfooting around with us, and they did treat us like men. And I don't remember anybody being insulted or embarrassed in that way. Uh, the only other thing I do remember, and this was funny. Like I said, Goodman was a pastor's son, and he was very, very religious, and he didn't swear at all. And you know, I never trust a Marine that couldn't swear. Never could trust him because there was something lacking there. But he was actually he really was a good man. Uh, but when the night before we graduated, they made him read a poem, and it was I don't remember the words to it. It was about a caterpillar, and it was about this caterpillar shimmering across the glistening glass on a mirror, and then going down and going. He picked him up and put him on the uh, the window, and the window was open, and the whole thing ended up by saying, "When that motherfucker reached the bottom of the window, I smashed his fucking head in." So this was what they made him read, and he actually read it better than I did. I hesitated a little bit more than he did because we knew better. You know, you don't hesitate, and it was actually funny. And it's one of the things I'm sure Goodman thought it was funny too because he laughed about it, but you couldn't laugh then. You could not laugh at it then. And you know, we graduated and it rained. And like I said, most of my platoon, all of them except for me, were from Southern California. Even though I joined the Marines from Los Angeles, my family was still back in Illinois. So everybody had family show up except for me. And one of the recruits who I became friends with, uh, Michael Workman, took me in with his family, and I spent, you know, graduation day with them, having food and talking and taking pictures and things like that. And then we went to Camp Pendleton. I was assigned to 0351, which was anti-tanks, assault man, which was 3.5 rockets and flamethrowers. And we went to Camp San Mateo, which is in the north end uh, of Camp Pendleton, where the 1st Marines were. The 1st Marines were at San Mateo, the 5th Marines were at Margarita, and the 7th Marines was probably don't interest anybody, but they were in Las Pogas. So the whole division was there at Camp Pendleton at that time. And I was in the 1st Marines. I was in Lima Company, 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. That's where I stayed for a year and a half. The older guys left that had come in from Okinawa. They trained us for about 3 months, and then most of them left. We had a couple of stragglers that stayed around until maybe February or March of '64. And then we had a new batch come in, and we trained those guys. And then March, I think it was March 3rd or 4th, we went down to San Diego and got on a troop transport. It was the Breckenridge. It was a Navy ship, not a warship. It wasn't a USS. It was I forget what they call it. It was just a Navy ship. And it was a World War II transport. And we had Army aboard. And that had to be hell for the Army because the Army, the Marines carried their covers different than the Army, and we were never allowed to put them in our waistband because it bent them. But the Army put them in their back. And whenever we would see a soldier, we'd grab his cover and throw it in the ocean. It was just something we did, but we always did it when there was like 8 of us and 2 of them, because we didn't want to get into a fight with them. But it got to be a habit, and then finally the army did what we did. We always wore our covers, uh, and we hardly ever took them off. But sometimes the wind would catch it, and especially on ship, and would blow them off. But we were really pretty careful. We kind of pulled them down close to our ears. And then we went to Okinawa. Well, first we went to Hawaii. We went to Hawaii. We spent a day and a half in Okinawa, Pearl Harbor. I mean, in Hawaii. Then we left. And I remember as we left the Midway, the USS Midway aircraft carrier came in, and I took a picture of it. And then we went to Yokohama we had Cinderella Liberty, which at 2400 we had to be back aboard ship. And then we went to Kin Village in Okinawa, and that was Camp Hansen. That was really in the middle part of Okinawa, in the center, but on the east side. And we were there for 2 months. And while we were there, the third Battalion, 9th Marines, were at Da Nang in Vietnam, but they were there only as security for the air base. They didn't do patrols. They weren't reinforced. They didn't have mortars. They didn't have artillery, tanks. They didn't have any of that. When we went to Vietnam on June 16th of 1965, we were reinforced. We had the air wing, we had the helicopter detachments, we had artillery, we had mortars, we had 106s, we had everything. And we relieved 3-9, but we also pulled search. We didn't call them search and destroy at first, and I don't remember what we called them when we first got there, but it was search and something. I know, but I can't remember. But it was maybe 3 or 4 months when we were there. Then they changed it to search and destroy missions. But when we were first there, I honestly don't remember. I know it was search and something. I just don't remember what it was much more soft. It was a softer word. And then we started doing ambushes, and I was assigned to rockets, and we hardly used rockets in patrols because they were too big, 2 they had a back blast, 3 you had to disassemble it because when you carried them you had to disassemble it, and then if you got in trouble you had to uncouple it and then screw it together and then put the round in. It was, if you were doing certain operations when we first got there, we used them more. But when we went on patrols, I got an M14, and I had made. I was a lance corporal when I went to Vietnam, and I made corporal like 6 months in country into Vietnam, and we hardly ever took the rockets out unless we went on like a battalion sweep or something. Or if we were we set up an ambush one time on a riverbank, and we were a blocking force. And the units were chasing the NVA, and really, I shouldn't say NVA, because in 65, there wasn't a lot of NVA in Vietnam. They were mostly Viet Cong. I think all the time I was there, I maybe seen 25 NVA, and that probably was close to all at once at one time. But we were setting up on this overview of a river, and we could hear the force coming in, and we started seeing sampans come down. And from where we were, you could look right down into the sampan and tell if they had weapons. And really, when they were running from us like that and being forced back, it really didn't matter. If they were coming towards us, they were the enemy. But we could look down and see them. And it probably was, at one point, we probably covered a mile. We could cover that mile of the river. We had 6 M60 machine guns, 1 on the end and 2 in the center, and then 1 kind of on each end toward the end. But we had 6 of them. We had 4 rocket launchers, the 3.5s that I had. And I never could figure out if Willie Peter was ever authorized. I've heard that it wasn't, but we used it all the time. We had Willie Peter rounds for the 3.5. We weren't allowed to have Willie Peter grenades. So the NBA or the Arvin had them, but we didn't. But when we set up on this blocking force, we said there was a whole lot of them. Obviously 25, 30 sampans. And when it kind of got to where we were, there was a leg of the river that went east and north. I don't think they knew we were there because right in front of us, they stopped and started gathering them with weapons. And most of them were just personal weapons, sidearms, but they had weapons. And the lieutenant had already told us that he would fire, when he fired the first shot, that we would open up with everything we had. Well, when you have a reinforced company like that and you're covering just a mile and you have sampans with probably 50 to 75, maybe, I know with less than 100 enemy in there, that's devastating firepower. Plus we had M79s too. And some of the guys, each squad had an M6, an M14 that had a selector that could make it fully automatic. And most of us, in my M14, I had a selector on it because if somebody got wounded, you'd go over and take his selector off his M14 so you could make yours automatic. Put the selector on. When he fired the first shot, we killed everybody in that kill zone in probably 30 seconds, if that. I mean, we tore them apart. It was unbelievable. It was like they went through a meat grinder. It was like they went through a shredder. And if anybody was alive, we just finished them off. And there were some that survived it, that were still in the water and in the sand, but most of the sampans were sunk. And we killed everybody. And then the rest of the battalion that was coming through, they went in and got them, and they became part of the battalion's body count. They were never ours. But I know that nobody survived that. No one. I put a Willie Peter round right in the center of one of the sampans, and it exploded, and you could hear them screaming because that white phosphorus is a deadly, and when I fired some high explosive rounds, and I probably fired between my team, I had 2 men in my team, 2 guns. We probably fired 6 rounds, maybe 8, because they really weren't effective. And it was over. By the time you could reload, the rest of the guys had wiped every bit out. But we fired probably 6 rounds, and probably the other team fired the same. It was devastating. Of all the battles that I was in, that was, first of all, was the most one-sided. Not one of us even got shot at, I don't think. If we did, we didn't know it. But we absolutely wasted them. And we got commended for it. Which, it was righteous, it was righteous warfare. But it was just unbelievable how quickly you can take 75, 80 men's lives, maybe 100, and then leave them just lying in the water. And some of them were, you'd see that there was blood all over, there was parts, and it was a terrible mess because you could look right down and see it. And nobody saw. If anybody survived, they were picked off. They were not given any chance to surrender or get weapons or anything. And most of them were killed initially, but there were some later, the other side, because they were closer to it, opened up. We didn't. That was when I was first there, and I was still with Charlie 19, which is 1st Battalion, 9th Marines. The 1st Battalion, 9th Marines were probably the most famous unit in Vietnam. We got our nickname, the Walking Dead, from Vietnam. Other units got them from World War II. The Magnificent Bastards, which was 2-4, they got theirs from World War II. A lot of the other ones got them from World War II. We didn't. And we got it because in our battalion, 750 names on the wall are from our battalion. The highest casualty rate in the history of the Marine Corps for one battalion to have seven. And I'm saying 750 because that's what we were told. Gone and counted. We've only counted from our rubbings from guys that we knew and later found out, but it was right around 750. That's a lot from one battalion. But it's also a period from 1966 or 1965. They left in 69, so it's about 3 years. Ho Chi Minh put warrants out on us. That's why there's two reasons we were called the Walking Dead. One was because so many of us had been killed. Two of them was because Ho Chi Minh had a bounty on us. And that was another reason, depending on who you talk to, how we got our name, the Walking Dead. But the Walking Dead has been, decommissioned. 19 was decommissioned in 94. Then they brought it back for the Gulf War for about a year and a half. And then it was decommissioned again, I think, in like 2009 or 10. I went from 19 on Halloween Eve's day, so the 30th of October of 65. I went from 19 to 11, and 11 was called the first of the first because they were the first battalion of the first Marines, but they didn't have a war name like 19 did. 19 had the war, So, but when I went to 11. I was very proud of 11 because they were an old outfit from the Second World War and even World War One. So they are still a very proud unit, First Battalion, First Marine, and I'm very proud of it. But I wear my 19 cover. I consider myself 19 unless I'm with somebody from 11, because that's who I went to war with. That's who I socialized with. Most of my friends I went to Vietnam with, including my drill instructor. We were his last platoon in boot camp, and I went to Lima Company, he went to Mike Company. So we seen him all the time. Then we went to Vietnam together. Out of the four of us that are still friends now, he's the only one that got wounded. And he got sent back home. Then he went back, and he went back with 2-4. And then when we came back for good, he went back again. And then he was at Dai Dao. He got wounded twice. Once while he was waiting to get evacuated for being wounded. He got wounded a second time. Then he came back to the States, recovered, went back with 1-4 for a third tour and got wounded again. So he got 4 Purple Hearts, and the other 3 of us, whenever we get together, we always say, well, we have 1 Purple Heart apiece. Because he had 4, we had none. After the war, and I went on the police force, I found one of my buddies. We stayed together all throughout Vietnam, and when we came back, we remained friends. I found my drill instructor at a reunion, Ray Del Rio, probably 12 years ago. And then I found another one of the guys who was in boot camp with me, through the VA. I'd gone to the VA, and we found out that we had not only had we gone to Vietnam together, we went to boot camp together also. So now the 4 of us, we meet about, like I said, every 3 months. We went to the Marine Corps Ball in November. Well, that's really the last time I seen him, but I talked to him probably once a week. I had the honor of serving with the finest men in the world in 2 different uniforms. And I mean that too, is what I went in from I went in from the Marine Corps to law enforcement. And I went with LAPD because I admired them only the short time I was out here. I went back to Illinois when I got out of the Marines and applied for Chicago Police, the Illinois State Police, and the LAPD, and I got the LAPD notice first, and then I came out to California, and I've been out here now since 1967. When we left the States in March, when we embarked, I'd never heard of Vietnam, never. Uh, there were Vietnamese Marines when I was in boot camp. There were Vietnamese Marines being trained there, but we didn't know who that was. They could have, I mean, they told us. I didn't know what Vietnam was any different than I would have known if they were from Saudi Arabia. But when we got to uh, Camp Hansen in Okinawa, and we changed from 3-1 to 1-9. That's when they told us that we were going to train in Okinawa, jungle training, when we were going to Vietnam. Because most of us thought if we went anywhere, we'd go to Korea, back to Korea. Korea was only 10 years before, but that's what we thought until Vietnam. And then even when we went to Vietnam, we went from Okinawa to Vietnam in ships and convoy. We had destroyers, kind of San Iwo Jima. We had Higgins boats, that we climbed down ropes to get, down into the ship. And then they took us into the Red Beach. When we got to Red Beach, there was Vietnamese there with banners that said, "Welcome, U.S. Marine." Kids were selling Cokes and pineapples, on the beach. And then we got in the 6-bys, drove to the air base. When we first got there, originally we were called, the Marine Corps had a softer tone than the Army did about Vietnam. Even our General Walt, and him and Westmoreland did not see eye to eye. We were more into trying to pacify the Vietnamese than the Army was. But the Army was also down, in the Mekong Delta. We were up in the I Corps, closer to right, next to the border, and probably didn't go any further south than My Lai and Chu Lai. My Lai and Chu Lai were real close together. That's probably as far south as we went. Then we went up to the Laotian Cambodian border. But we never really went there. We never went to the A Shaw, none of that. I remember hearing about, the 7th Cavalry in A Shaw in November of 65, but it was an Army unit. We didn't realize how big of a battle that was until much, much later. But when we first got there, I want to say it was called like Search and Pacification or something like that. And then it was changed. But we would go out into the villages with corpsmen, and we would treat the kids, give them candy, and if they had bruises, they really couldn't do a lot. There was no inoculations, but they'd put bandages and alcohol, and we never, as long as we were at Da Nang, we got hit once. One night, sappers came in. And that was in August of 65. And it was the first time that Da Nang had been assaulted, other than with mortars. There was no artillery even then, but the VC had mortars. But we were on the base, and actually I was back in my tent because I was on a different ship. And as soon as the rounds went off, we all ran up into our positions. And when they retreated, we ended up killing 2 of the sappers, but they ended up blowing up like 4 or 5 of the planes and killing 2 airmen that were guarding the plane. And the first American casualties I ever saw were the 2 dead airmen at Da Nang. And that was the first time I ever seen an M16, because I thought it was a toy. And the sappers didn't take them. So their whole purpose was to blow up planes, not to get the weapons, because both of them, their weapons were beside their bodies. And we retrieved the bodies, and then the Air Force came and took them away. Then we went out into the brush. We went out into the bush. We didn't go, we left Da Nang behind, and then I got transferred to 1-1 in October. And with 1-1, the night I got there, they got hit. And they overran. The Marine brass never liked the term overran, but I was in the CP that night, and there were in amongst us. I shot one with a 45, in the back, because that's all I had was a 45 and 3 magazines, one in the pistol and 2 on my belt, because I hadn't been assigned to a unit yet. I hadn't been assigned to relieve the rocket team yet when I got there. And that night they killed 14 of us. They killed 15, 14 Marines and 1 Navy corpsman, and we killed 38 of them. And in the morning we all got, and it was like hell. Everything was still burning. There were and there were Americans intermingled, and we really didn't care about the Viet Cong. We got our dead and our wounded out, and by now it was daylight. We called in a medevac, and we had our dead. We put them in ponchos and took 2 ponchos, one to lay them on and another one to cover them with, and we laid them out. And then when the medevacs came, they put them on the helicopters and took them away. The VC, first of all, we just left them there because, one, we were pissed because 2 of our guys had been tortured, and we seen what they had done to them, and we were pissed. And then there was a village down below us, and we were pissed at the village because we know they formed in that village. And I mean, now that I look at life and things are different, I knew that those villagers had to do what they did, but at the time it didn't matter to us. We were pissed at that village and those villagers, and we went down there, and we did catch a couple of the stragglers, and they were killed. I think, if I remember correctly, and I could be completely wrong, but I know there was at least 2 stragglers, and I think there was 3 or 4, and they were killed in the village. And the villagers were so scared of us that we weren't really that angry at them, but they didn't say anything to us either, because I think if they would have said anything, there would have been trouble. But they didn't. We killed the straggler, and we had to lay the dead out, the dead VC out. And a lot of them were dismembered. A lot of them, they were almost all bloody, body parts. And we had to lay them out because General Westmoreland had to come and view the bodies. It pissed us off that we had to do that because they had a bulldozer come by and dig a pit. And honestly, when I look back at it, I remember it looked to me just like the Holocaust, with the pits, and the bodies were right beside it, but they were laid out. And then Westmoreland came, and when he came in the morning, it was like we were soldiers. There were Hueys all over the fucking place, and we tried to get air support during the night to just drop flares. All we got was our mortars flying, dropping flares for us during the night in the battle. We couldn't get a Huey. In fact, most of us didn't know what a Huey was other than by name, because we had never seen that many gunships in Vietnam at that time. But Westmoreland must have had 5 or 6 of them. They were flying, they flew around us, and then he kind of was at the tail. He came up and he landed to give out the Purple Hearts and the view of the bodies. Because there was probably 5 or 6 of us that were walking wounded, and we were lined up to get our medals. Well, first of all, they didn't have only 2. They only had 2 Purple Hearts, and I think there was 6 or 7 of us that were wounded, walking wounded. And when Westmoreland got off the helicopter, he was in starched utilities, no weapon, no web gear, and his baseball hat. No helmet, and starched, everything was starched, and his shoes were spit shine. And that pissed most of us off again, that he would come out there like that. I know he was a general. I know he was a full 4-star general. I knew that, but it didn't matter to us because it just pissed us off more. We were already pissed off because he had all the gunships up there, and they were Army gunships. When he landed in Army helicopters, And then, but in the same helicopter that he was in, General Westmoreland was in, General Walt was in. General Walt was the commanding general of the Marine Expeditionary Force that was in Vietnam. He was a major general. And when he got out, he had his helmet on, and it was strapped around his chin. He had his web gear on. He had a 45, and his utilities were kind of starched, you know. But when you're in jungle, we didn't even have jungle utilities then. We still had the Sateen World War, Korean War vintage stuff. We didn't have jungle utilities yet. We had the old stuff that took forever to dry and just had a few pockets up here, no pockets in the bottom. And but when he got out, when West Warner came up to us, and he was very, you know, I knew he was a West Pointer. I mean, I knew a little bit about General Westmoreland. Um, I knew a little bit about General Walt because we had seen him in Okinawa. Um, but when General Westmoreland came to us, he had his adjutant in front of him, and his adjutant was a pain in the ass. He had his little hoagie ropes, we called them, if you know what I'm talking about, that the aide de camps have. I didn't understand why you'd have that in combat gear. I know that was for when you were in your dress blues or you're in your green, but I didn't understand. And he was in front of Westmoreland. Well, the reason he was in front is because he made sure that we answered the questions, you know, that were coming up. And he also took the Purple Hearts from the first two guys and brought them down and gave them the next first three. I think they ended up with 3 Purple Hearts is all they brought. And then he went back and got the first ones and then brought them down and give them to the guys, you know, at the end, which didn't endear him to us. But General Westmoreland was I don't, you know, all my family was in the Army. I honor the Army. I respect them, but they're just not Marines. They're just not. The General Westmoreland had the weakest handshake I can ever remember for an officer. It was very weak. He didn't ask me anything. You know, he did ask a couple of the guys, you know, where they were hit and how they were doing. He didn't ask me anything. He just shook hands, and then moved on. Oh, he did put the purple. He pinned the Purple Heart on my shirt, on my uniform. But you know, right behind him was General Walt. And when General Walt came up to me, I mean, first of all, he was a bear of a man. You know, he's like 6'4", probably 220 pounds. And Westmoreland's, you know, was thin and older. And but he came up and he grabbed my hand, and my hand almost disappeared in his grip. And then he put his arm around me, and I'm going, damn, don't hit me too hard, you know, my arm's sore. And he asked me where I was from, what unit I was with. You know, it was just more, and we liked the fact that he had a weapon. We liked that because we knew if something happened, he could defend himself. What would General Westmoreland do? He'd have got back in the helicopter and probably left. Because, you know, the battle had just been maybe 8, you know, it probably was 8 or 9 hours before. I mean, there could have still been snipers and that around. There weren't, no, because we really and they really did clear that area out because they knew he was coming also. So, but that was my first real big sting of battle. The ambush we had, and you know, patrols. Patrols are like skirmishes. You know, we never had any large scale patrols until I went up to Hue. We went up to Fubai. We flew up to Fubai. The first Marines went up to Fubai. And then we worked out of Fubai. And then in Fubai, we went up to Hue. But we weren't allowed to go into the city. We were only allowed to go along the outskirts because we were there on search and destroy mission. So you weren't allowed to go into the city of Hue, but we went on to the outskirts of the city, but we didn't go where the Citadel was, or the Perfume River, or any of that. We went on that. And I remember I was a corporal by then. I got very bitter about the way the war was run in Vietnam. Not the Marine Corps, not the Army, but I was very annoyed with lifers that when we were in the States, they were sergeants and staff sergeants. They were supposed to. We had a gunnery sergeant that was the very best. So I'm not categorizing all of them, but I had a very distinct dislike for lifers, because once we got to Vietnam, I was 19 years old. These guys were in their late 20s and early 30s and had been in the Marine Corps all their careers, 8, 9, 10 years. Some of them were even in Korea. And yet, every time I would go out, I would be in charge of the patrol. The lifers didn't go. The only time they ever went is if it was a company size and they had to go, and then even then they stayed back, in a CP area. Because if we go on a patrol, they'd be in the back. It just, I had a really bad experience with one staff sergeant that I didn't like in the States. So, I didn't like him in Vietnam even worse. He was utterly worthless. He was, I don't use the word coward very easily. I've only known 2 cowards in my life, and he was one of them. And I just didn't like him. I didn't like him in the States, and he was really not good. I had an incident with him because we had traded. Like I said, we couldn't have Willie Peter grenades, but the Arvins could. So we would trade some of our baseball grenades for their Willie Peter grenade. But a Willie Peter grenade's a cylinder. It's not a baseball type grenade. And they stood out. They were gray. And I had a couple of them, and we were going through a French bunker, and we seen that was one of the very few times I seen NVA. They ran into this French bunker ahead of us. Well, that was stupid. They can't get out. The only thing they could do is shoot at us from there. Well, they're zigzagged in the back. And so we seen them, and I told the guys, let's go get them. And we got up there, and there was 4 of us. And I was going to throw the Willie Peter grenade. You don't throw a Willie Peter grenade, you roll it. You roll it, because if you throw it, it can bounce because it's cylindrical. And you don't even throw a regular grenade. You try to roll it so it doesn't come back at you. And like I said, there's zigzags in there, but I was going to throw it into this bunker and French fry these 2 guys that went in there. And, they would have got burnt. They probably would have come out, and then we was going to kill them. And that's just pure and simple. We were going to kill them. And we knew they were NVA because of their helmets. And this sergeant came up to me and said, that's unauthorized ammo. And he took it from me. And he took it from me while I had pulled the pin. I still had a hold of the grip. But I had the pin out. And he takes it. He takes it from me. And he throws it. But he threw it in there. And it hit the edge of the bunker, and it flipped up. And when it went off, half of it went in, but half of it was all over the place. And a piece of the Willie Peter hit him right in the upper lip. That was so wonderful. I know that's terrible to say, but he was such a jerk. He really was. And it burned him, and he got a Purple Heart for it, which annoyed us even more because he did it himself. You're not supposed to get Purple Hearts for hurting yourself, but he did. But then I went to 1-1 and got away from him. 1-1, I loved the 1-1 also. We went further up north, but I never went further north than Hue. I never went to Cantian or Quai Son. I had led a patrol, and I was coming back to Phu-Bai. And my really good friend, they were going out on a patrol. And we had stopped on this road. And I'm covered in sweat. I have a picture of it, but I'm covered in sweat. And I was skinny. I'm skinny now, but I was skinny then. And I was, we'd been in country almost a year. And my buddy told me, he said, John, he says, you're going home. I said, Jerry, if you're lying to me, I'm going to kill you right here and now. He said, no, I seen your orders when I was in the company office. You're on the orders to go home. I says, damn. I says, well, Jerry, I'm telling you, if you're lying to me, I will hunt you down and kill you. And so I came back, and as soon as I got back from our patrol, we changed. We had to give up we had to unload when you went back into the CP, and not put rounds into his chamber. So we had to unload. Uh, and then I went to the CP, and sure as hell, my name was on the list. And he says, "When do you want to go?" I says, "Well, when can I get out?" He says, "The helicopter out there now." Went back, told my buddies from 1-1 goodbye, packed my sea bag, jumped on that helicopter, went into Da Nang. From Da Nang, we flew to Kadena in Okinawa, the Air Force Base. We had to go in there in 3 days to get our service record books, to get paid. They paid us in cash. We all through into my Marine Corps career up until Vietnam, I got paid in cash. We never got paid in checks. You got paid in cash, even in the States. And we got paid in cash. I had like about almost $3,000 in cash, all in tens and twenties in my wallet. And we all got paid. We all got service record books. We all got to go into the PX and eat, and then we got on I don't know, one of those big transports, and we flew home to Point Magoo. And not Point Magoo, the air base, it's gone now. I forget where it is in Orange County. But we landed over there, and then my uncle came and got me. And I remember the one when I got home to my uncle's house. He said, "John," he said, "did you listen to me?" And I said, "Well," because he had told me when I went to Vietnam. He said, "There's two things you have to remember. One, you take care of your men because they depend on you. You are their lifeline. You have to look out for them. Take care of your men." He said, "Did you take care of your men?" I said, "Yes, I did. I took care of them." I said, "None of my guys got killed. A couple of them got wounded, but none of them got killed." I said, "I felt bad leaving them there, but I says, I felt good coming home." He says, "Okay, remember the second thing I told you when you went to Vietnam?" And I said, "Yes." I said, "Uncle Mike, I remember." He said, "You told me not to lose my soul." He said, "You can lose your heart, you can lose your life, you can lose your arm, you can lose your leg. But if you lose your soul, you're going to go to hell when you come back, because your life will be ruined after that." And I said, I never murdered no one. I never raped no one. I never did dope. In fact, dope was almost unheard of when I was in Vietnam. It become later, I know it was more widespread. If you would have even smoked marijuana in those days, they'd have flown you back and threw you out. It just wasn't. It wasn't never a problem. I don't remember anybody even smoking marijuana, and when I was in Vietnam. So, but when I came back home, I was very bitter about the way the lifers had what they had done to us in Vietnam and the things that they did. But I still loved the Marines, and I still had a year to go. And at that time, they had a policy in the Marine Corps that if you did 3 years in the infantry and you had a 4-year enlistment, you could go wherever you want out of the infantry. So I put in for Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, Marine Corps Base 29 Palms, and Marine Corps Base Barstow. I got H&S 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines at Camp Lejeune. I went back into the infantry, which when I went down there was only like 50 of us in the whole place that were Vietnam vets. All of them were young kids. They all looked up to us, especially guys that had medals. And, we had one guy that had a Silver Star. And we had 2 or 3 guys that had Bronze Stars. That looks impressive to young kids. And then, we went on a Mediterranean or Caribbean cruise right away. Went down to Puerto Rico and did training down there. We went to Cuba. We went to Curacao. We went to then it was called the Dutch Antilles. Later it became Aruba. We went to we ended up going to the Virgin Islands, the American Virgin Islands, and then we came back to Camp Lejeune. And then I had, I think, like 3 months. And this would have been in early 1967. And I was a sergeant by then. And I still loved the Marine Corps. I mean, I loved it then. I was just bitter about the war, but not about the Marine Corps and not about the military. I was pissed off about the lifers. I thought that they did a disservice to us because they were the ones who were supposed to be leading us. All my friends that got killed in Vietnam were lance corporals. All four of them, they were my personal friends. All four of them were lance corporals, and all four of them were machine guns because they always called machine guns up when something happened. Um, but I never had any corporals or sergeants get killed when I was there that I knew of. And that hurt when I came back home. Um, and I became very disillusioned. And then the war movement was coming on in 67. That hadn't occurred yet. But in 67, there were demonstrations, and that pissed me off. When I came, there was some demonstration at Camp Lejeune. There was demonstrations in Puerto Rico, but the ones in Puerto Rico were about independence. They wanted to be independent. They didn't want to be part of the United States. Um, but when I got out of the Marines in June of '67, uh, the career advisors came up to me as a gunnery sergeant, and I liked him. He was a good guy. He was one of the good guys at Camp Lejeune. And he said, John, I got to give you a shipping over lecture. I said, Gunny, I wouldn't extend 30 minutes I wouldn't extend 15 minutes for a 30-minute coffee break. I'm done, you know. And then to top it off, my discharge paper was on the 24th of June. It was a Sunday. I had to go on Liberty Friday and Saturday. I couldn't leave Friday because I was on Liberty. I only could go on Liberty. And then Sunday I had to go in and get my discharge papers. That made no sense. But, and then I came home and went back home to Illinois. And then I applied for the 3 different police departments. And I came out here to California. And I was probably in 1972 or 1973, I joined the reserves because I still loved the Marine Corps. And my bitterness had gotten over. The war was done with. I was in anti-war demonstrations. I went on the police department in 67 in December, but I didn't graduate from the police academy till May of 68. The riots and the anti-war stuff, it was going on heavy then. And, then I stopped being bitter about the military and started being bitter about politics. And, in 68 was the first time I could vote. And I didn't like Nixon and I didn't like Humphrey, but it was my first time to vote. So I voted for George Wallace, not because he was going to be president. I knew that he could never be president, but I thought maybe the Democrats or the Republicans could get the word that there was somebody else out there and they could get their shit together. And here it is 60 years later and they still haven't. And then after that, I voted for whoever I felt was the most qualified. My bitterness left. I'm still, I get bitter depending on who I talk to. If it's an anti-war person, my bitterness can come up like that. But if I'm talking to another vet and he tells me about his experiences, I understand him. Especially like I have a group with the vet centers. I don't know if you're familiar with vet centers. The vet centers were founded by Vietnam veterans because we were treated so badly. And to be in a vet center, you had to be a combat vet. So I belong to the vet center that's 4 or 5 miles from here in Chatsworth. We had a World War II vet, but he passed away. We had 3 Korean vets. 2 of them have passed away. The other one's now in the hospital. So, and I just turned 80. We're all in our late 70s and 80s. There's a couple of guys that are Iraq veterans. We had one that was an Iraq veteran that was actually super, and he was one of the facilitators, one of the people who held our group together, and he had gotten out of the Marines and had gone to school and had a degree. So he taught our class. And but he was wounded in Iraq. He was in Fallujah. He understood us. And he was absolutely amazing. And in this group is amazing. I have outside the guys that I served with in Vietnam and some of my police friends, they are my closest friends. Of the top 20 men that I have in my life that are my good friends, they are in it. They are uh, three of us are Marines. The one that I went to boot camp with is in the same group. That's how we met. But all the other guys are in the Army. There's one that was a corpsman. Corpsmen are more like Marines than Marines are, because they chose to be corpsmen, but they chose to go and become first aid to Marines. And all of us called for corpsmen. In Vietnam, we called for corpsmen for ourselves. We called for corpsmen for our friends. When my really good friend died right in front of me, the first person to him was a corpsman. And that was one of the other bitter things I got about. I was leading the patrol, but when we got hit right outside the gate, right outside the fence, a booby trap, a bouncing Betty went off and killed my friend and another Marine and wounded two more. But I was in the center. I didn't get hit. Um, I called for a medevac, and the staff sergeant back in the battalion area wouldn't said corporals can't call in medevacs. I said, well, it's my patrol. He said, I'm coming out. And he did come out in about 10 minutes. In the meantime, my friend died. He would have died anyway. It wasn't that he was going to live. It was the asshole attitude of it. It didn't make sense to me. And that had never happened before. And maybe it was because we were close to the wire and he could get to us. Because if we were out in the bushes and got hit, they didn't come out. We just called for a medevac, and sometimes we got it, and sometimes they sent Amtrak to pick us up. They didn't like send, a helicopter. So like I joined the reserves. I loved it. I stayed in it. I had to get out of the reserves because I worked undercover. And when I worked undercover, I had to have a beard and a bald head and earrings. And, so I had to withdraw. And then when I worked 7 years as an undercover officer, when I came back, they wouldn't let me come back. But the Marines are like that. If once you leave, they don't like you to come back. If you leave, they don't like it. So that's kind of, I was very idealistic. I've had arguments with some of my best friends, not my really good friend, but some of my good friends that are in 1-9 that aren't really part of that 20-man group, about how I felt about. I told them straight out. I said, I never fought for the guy on my left or the guy on my right. I said, I fought for the United States. I said, I'm an American. Those guys didn't take care of me when I got wounded. They're not taking care of me now in the vet center. And I said, I was in weapons platoon. The guy on my right and my left, every time I went out was different. I said, but I would die for them. And I expected them to die for me. I would die for them, but I didn't fight for them. And, a lot of guys get pissed off at that. But I try to explain to them that I know they would have died for me. And I would have died for them. I would have given my life for them. But I didn't fight for them. I just didn't. I fought for the United States. It was a little, maybe I was a little, I was still very idealistic then. Now I don't say it so much anymore because I don't want to get in arguments. I'm 80 years old. Am I going to argue about something that happened 60 years ago? But as you can see on my walls and stuff, I still got Marine stickers, patches. I wear Marine Corps shirts. I love the Marine Corps. I love the United States. I love America. I love what I am. My children are good citizens. My grandchildren are all good citizens. They believe, they believe a little bit different than I do. That is true because of my experience. Neither one of my sons went into law enforcement or into the military. Neither one of them. None of my grandchildren will. They're just not. I talked to the one that's 20. He won't. He's in South Carolina. He doesn't. He has no inkling. The 16-year-old, he's a brainaholic. He doesn't, want to join the military. He's not fit for it. So I just say, okay, I paid your debt, but I paid my debt to my uncle. When he died, I went to see him. I could look him in the face look him right straight in the eye and say, Uncle Mike, I'm sorry that you're suffering so much in your life, and you suffered so much for our country. I said, I know that I can look you right straight in the face and tell you that God will come and get you when you die. And he died a couple of days later after I had seen him last. And the same with my other uncle who was in World War II. My When I go and see my friends now that are Vietnam, I can look them in the eye. I can say, you know what? I fought for my country. Um, some of these guys, especially some of them that are younger, that haven't seen combat yet, and most of the younger kids have, if they were in Iraq, because they deploy so much. But some of them haven't. And I said, they have a different view of combat. I said, every person takes combat different. I said, I said, to be honest with you, I said, combat made me angry and made me a better Marine. Because when I seen it, I became angry and I became more protective of not only myself, but my men and the people around me. I said, so I became more, but I also became very vocal about the lifers and stuff. And I would still do not like lifers. And I'm not really fond of officers either. They just didn't do anything. They just didn't. And that was wrong of them. But there was a lot of them. I had a colonel, Wesley West, who had earned the Medal of Honor, who I was the best of friends with. Colonel Fox, Wesley Fox, I don't know where I got. Wesley Fox passed away. I went back to Arlington to his funeral because I admired him, even though he was a lieutenant when he earned the Medal of Honor in Vietnam in my outfit. I knew him he was like my father. He was like my uncle. I shouldn't have been like my father. He was a Korean War vet during the Bronze Star and the Purple Heart in Korea, and then earned the Medal of Honor in Vietnam. So it isn't, I don't, individuals I can take, it's the group. They have a mentality to think that I can dig their foxhole and they can sleep in it, and I have to go and dig my own again. I didn't like that. They can dig their own, but they wouldn't. They wouldn't. They just wouldn't. They refused. We had to do it. Why? I never could figure that out. I never could figure why it was supposed to be when you went to combat, if an officer came into the chow line, he was supposed to get at the back in combat. Just the opposite of what it was in the States. In the States, they got fed first. They had their own mess hall, their own area, and they could cut in front of you. But in combat, it was supposed to be the opposite, and they never adhered to that, never once. And neither did the staff sergeants. The only one that did was the gunnery sergeant. He did. He would get at the back. But he was a man. They weren't. And that's, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, but I think a lot of guys felt like I do. I'm sure if you've done this for years, you probably get the same thing. I when I got out of the Marine Corps, I still loved it. And if it hadn't been for Vietnam, I probably would have stayed in the Marines. But it was because of Vietnam and the way the war was handled, not only politically, but they did change it later. And that's the sad part about being there early. They took advantage of things, where later they saw what had happened in 65, 66, and Tet kind of changed everything. So Rick, I still admire what officers do, but I admire sergeants more. Most officers are men. That's true, but a lot of them don't have balls. I mean, they just don't. They're used to being treated. I don't know. Maybe it's my British heritage, but I don't like lords and ladies, and I don't really care that much for digging a foxhole for a lieutenant who tells me it's not deep enough, and I haven't even dug mine yet, and it's getting dark. Those are the things that stick with you. But overall, like I said, I can meet anybody and like them. We had the same in the police department was very similar to the Marine Corps and the military. It's paramilitary. Um, there's guys that would tell you what to do in a riot and then not go out at all. They'd tell you what to do, but they wouldn't do it themselves. So it's not something um, that I'm alone with. I think it happens, and I didn't mean to rag on anybody. I shouldn't do that because I'm not. I'm just talking about the ones that I had contact with, and there were two of them that were absolutely not like that. Two lieutenants. One got killed over in Vietnam after I had left, and one was a salt of the earth guy. Came back, but I don't go to 1-1's reunions. I go to 1-9's reunion. So I've never seen him, since Vietnam. And but if he was here right now, I would tell him the same thing, but I would get up and shake his hand and tell him, I'm not talking about you. And he could probably say the same thing as me. All sergeants were not good either. And, I like to think I did my duty. See, I always thought the Vietnam was my duty. I never thought it was a job. I never thought I went there because I was trying to prove something. I always thought it was my duty to my family, to my heritage, to my country. And when I went on the police force, I never thought that it was a job either. I always thought it was a duty. It's a duty for me to step between the weak and keep the bad guys, the strong bad guys, from getting to the weak people who can't defend themselves. It was up to me to. Now I'm 80, I can't defend myself like I did when I was 30 or even 40. I know I'm 80, but I can. I don't even carry my gun anymore. I used to up until about 3 years ago. I can barely walk. So why am I gonna? I couldn't use it. I mean, I got enough sense to realize that I've lived a good life. I know that when I die, my children will be proud of me. I know that my grandchildren will be proud of me. But more importantly, my friends that come to my funeral will be able to say that he was a good man. And I've said that about every Marine, cop, civilian that I've ever gone to a funeral for, that he was a good man. And that's all you can be. I never lost my soul. Never. Never, never, never. I still have it. When my time comes, God can take it. I can be with my mom and dad and we lost two children and our granddaughter. I'll be with them, and I know that. Um, and I've always known it. From day one to the day I was old enough to know, I've never lost my faith. It's sustained me throughout my whole life. And other guys have not. Guys have found it, lost it, and discarded it. And that's too bad. I go to Camp Pendleton all the time, and I talk to the young Marines. So what I tell them is what my uncle told me. Two things you got to remember: take care of your men, and don't lose your soul. And I think the young soldiers and Marines that are in our armed forces right now, they're all volunteers. Because when I was in Vietnam, we didn't have any draft. The draft came later. Oh, we didn't have any draftees, but there were draftees in the Marine Corps later. I would tell them to stay strong. Don't give up your core beliefs. Don't give up your ethos. I think the Secretary of War, Hegseth, said the very finest compliment that he said to the Marines. He said the Marines never gave up their standards. They never lowered them for guys to get in. If you didn't want to get in the Marines, go in and, don't go in, or go somewhere where you're going to be happy. The Army, the Air Force. I don't think anybody that went in the Marines could not have gone into the Army. They could have. One of the finest guys I ever knew was Audie Murphy. He was turned down to go into the Marines. He went into the Army, and look what he became. So that's what I said. Be what you can be. Always believe in your heart that you're better than anybody, including the next Marine beside you. Think you're better than him, because he thinks he's better than you, and you'll be a perfect team. what I learned from Vietnam. Like I said, when I came back from Vietnam, I was very bitter, and I have a different outlook now because I'm a grandfather and I'm elderly, and um, but Vietnam for me was when I finally was able to tell my uncles and my father and my grandfather that what you did wasn't forgotten. And what you did, what you accomplished, I'm just honing and making it sharper. These young kids now, they're living off our legacy. I'm the Vietnam, the World War II vets, there's so few of them anymore. It's hard to even find any anymore. And even the Korean vets, there's not a lot of. Most, even in my my Marine Corps League group, our average age is 74. 74, that's our average. We have some Iraq guys, we have some, guys that are in their 80s that are Korean vets. Oh, we don't have any World War II vets anymore. Our last Iwo Jima veteran died about 4 years ago. But the young kids, all I tell them, remember that one day your children or grandchildren are going to live off your legacy, and what you produce here will prevent them from making mistakes. Like Vic said, with the guys now in Iraq, one of the things I'm proudest about Vietnam, the Iraq and Afghanistan were never treated like we were. Never. When I went to the big parade in Hollywood for a Desert Storm parade, and I was on the corner, and it started, and the very first vehicle was General Westmoreland in a Jeep, and I walked, weren't supposed to, but I walked across the street and shook his hand because he lived the same thing I lived through. He was a part of me, and I was a part of him, and his legacy, he was treated badly by people above him. That's really the only advice that I can say. Look for the man that's a man, and live a good life, and don't ever lose your soul. Don't ever do that. Don't, and your soul's your own. No one can tell you if you've lost it or not. Only you know. Only you know. So, when I came back from one of the proudest things that I really say, and I'll say it again, is that the newer veterans were not mistreated as we were. They were not. And we, for the first time ever, about 7, 8 years ago, I wore this hat to dinner, and I went to pay at the end, and somebody had bought my dinner, my wife and I's dinner. That was the first time ever, ever. And it's only been 2 times since then. But most people now say, thank you for your service. And I'd rather they didn't say that. I would rather they say, thank you for what you did, because it's blasé. It's like, sorry for your loss. Sorry for your loss doesn't mean shit in my book. And I was a homicide detective for 20 years. I hated it when my partners would go up to a victim's family and say, sorry for your loss. That don't mean anything. What means something is, I'm sorry you have to go through this. We're here to help you. We will make things easy for you. We will help you through the coroner's inquest. We will help you because we know you're suffering. It's the same in the military. So, I know people mean it nicely when they say, but it became so blasé now that I like it much better. A guy gave me a card that said, because of you, I can sit here and have dinner with you. Sitting at he must have passed them out, at dinners. He said, because of you, my wife and I can sit at a table and have dinner. And we thank you for that. And, he gave me that. And that means I keep it. I kept it. But that's just me. Other guys like it. But I think if you say something more personal, shake their hand, say, I'm really glad you're home. I'm sorry you were mistreated. Hey, you were in the Marines. I was in the Marines. Something like that to me is more personal. But those are my lessons for, what I learned from Vietnam is I paid back, and I relived the legacy of my family and my country, and I laid out the blueprints for those now that are coming through, and they will lay out, the Marine Corps is changing. Damn, there's no more battalions and regiments anymore. There's guys that are only, 15 or 20 of them go out with drones and are doing warfare. So, it's all going to change, because big battalions and regiments, they go out and fight, they'll be dead in 10 minutes with the weapons that are out there now.